The Screaming Staircase, Chapter 24. He was still dressed in the same white shirt and gray suit pants he'd worn at the beginning of the night, but everything else about the old man had changed. His slate gray jacket was gone, replaced by a tunic of shiny steel mesh that hugged his chest and hung loose below his belly in a shimmering cascade. His upper arms were shirt-sleeved, but metal gauntlets protected his wrists and hands. As before, he supported himself on his bulldog-handled walking stick, only now the wooden membrane had been removed, revealing a long, slim rapier within. Strangest and most grotesque of all was the helmet that he wore, a smooth steel skull cap with a projecting rim around the back of the neck and bulging leather goggles strapped below the brow plate. The lenses shone glassily. His eyes could not be seen. All in all, Mr. Fairfax had the look of a demonic frog, both horrible and ridiculous at the same time. He raised the lantern and stood in its swirling smoke-filled light, considering us. Then he smiled, showing his silver-coated teeth. "Oh, you're a cool customer, Mr. Lockwood," Fairfax said. "I'll grant you that. I'm more and more impressed with you. It's a shame we didn't meet in other circumstances. You could have a permanent job with me." I don't know how Lockwood did it, but despite the revolver pointed at his chest, despite the torn coat, the bloodstains, the spots of plasm, magnesium, salt, and ash on his clothes, despite the trailing cobwebs in his hair and the scratches on his face and hands, he still made a decent stab at looking unperturbed. "You're very kind," he said. "But aren't you going to introduce us to your friend?" He glanced at the figure with the gun. "I don't think we've had the pleasure." If not quite as tall as Fairfax, this man was very heavily muscled and broad across the shoulder. His face, what I could see of it, was young and clean-shaven. He too wore a frog-like helmet and a set of body armor, and carried a rapier at his belt. Fairfax chuckled dryly. "Piercy Greb, my chauffeur and personal assistant. Used to be an agent with the Hambleton Agency before it was swallowed up by the Fitz. A very capable fellow, and still an excellent swordsman. In fact, you're already acquainted. Piercy paid you a little visit the other night." "Oh, yes," Lockwood said. "Our masked intruder. I stabbed you, didn't I? How's your stomach doing?" "Bearing up," Greb said. "Just another little inquiry to add to the long list you've caused us, Mr. Lockwood," Fairfax said. "Look at this wall." He gestured at the pile of stones and the ragged hole through which magnesium smoke still gently drifted. "Really, I'm shocked. I did request that no incidentalities be brought into my house." "Sorry about that," Lockwood said. "On the bright side, we've located and destroyed your source, so we'll be looking forward to our second payment as soon as the banks open later this morning." Another chuckle. "Insane optimism is another quality I admire, Mr. Lockwood, but I must say, it's your ability to survive that most astounds me. I truly thought the horror of the Red Room would have killed you hours ago. I watched you go inside. I locked the door. Yet now I find you re-emerging like three dusty woodworms from a completely different part of the house. Quite extraordinary. Clearly you found a way out of the Red Room, which is impressive enough, but to discover the ultimate source, tell me, was it the Red Duke? That was my favorite theory." "No, it was the staircase in the monks. We found their well." "Really? A well through there?" The opaque goggles flashed in the lantern light. The voice grew thoughtful. "How interesting. You'll have to show me presently." At my side, George stirred uneasily. Yes, not necessarily a great idea to mention the well there, Lockwood. Lockwood grinned. Oh, Mr. Fairfax is a reasonable man. Besides, he wants to talk to us first, don't you, Fairfax? Silence from beneath the helmet. At Fairfax's side, the other figure did not stir. The revolver hung suspended in the dark, directed at our stomachs. Yes. The voice was suddenly harsh, decisive. And we can do it in more comfortable surroundings. I'm tired and I need to sit down. Greb, take our friends up to the library. If either of these boys tries anything, feel free to shoot the girl. Lockwood said something, but I didn't hear what. Beneath my shock and terror, anger stirred. This was Fairfax's immediate assumption that I was the least danger, the weak link of the team. That I could be used to bind the others to good behavior was scarcely a threat myself. I set my face into a neutral mask and stared straight ahead as we filed past the old man and away toward the stairs. In the library, the electric lamps were turned on full. After so many hours in blackness, the effect was viciously bright. We stumbled to the nearest chairs with our arms across our faces. Greb motioned us to sit. He took a position beside the bookshelves, arms loosely folded, his gun pillowed on a bulging bicep. We waited. Finally, there came a slow, painful tapping of a stick across the lobby, and Fairfax entered. Light gleamed on the metal skull cap. It shone, too, on the great hook nose, giving him more than ever the appearance of a stooped and hulking bird of prey. Hesitantly, he advanced to a leather chair below the wall of photographs, and with an extended sigh of relief sank into its depths. As he sat, the edges of his metal corset spread out about him with gentle clinking sound. At last, he said. We were hanging around that cursed cellar for hours after we heard the explosion. All right, Greb, you can take it off. We're safe from ghosts in here. He bent his neck and removed the helmet before pulling off the goggles. They'd left a red wheal across his brow. The jet-black eyes were screwed up with discomfort. His face was etched with age. Up on the wall, the photo of his youthful self stared out with all of its swash and swagger. Fairfax, the actor, smooth and handsome in codpiece earrings and too tight leggings, moodily contemplating a plaster skull. Below the picture, the real thing slumped bent and careworn, wearily coughing in his chair. It was strange to see how completely the years had changed him, how he'd steadily devoured his strength and drained that vitality away. Greb took off his helmet too. He turned out to have a remarkably thin head, much too small for his body's muscled build. It looked like a bowling pin. He wore his hair in a cropped military cut, and his mouth was thin and cruel. Fairfax set his goggles and the helmet down on the nearest side table, on top of the books Lockwood had studied several hours before. He glanced around the room with an air of satisfaction. I like this library, he said. It's my frontier. At night, it forms the borderland between the worlds of the living and the dead. I come here often to do the test the latest equipment my factories are producing. All the iron keeps me fairly safe, but I have my armor too, which allows me to walk deep into the house unscathed. George stirred. That armor? It looks like you're wearing a dress. Fairfax's eyes narrowed. Insults at a time like this, Mr. Cubbins? Is that wise? Well, when you're being held at gunpoint by a geriatric madman in a metal skirt, you've kind of hit rock bottom anyway, George said. It can't really get much worse. The old man laughed unpleasantly. That remains to be seen, but you're mistaken to be so dismissive. This dress is made from an advanced type of steel, mostly iron, which gives it warding power with aluminum alloy that makes it much lighter than usual. ease of movement, and full protection. The helmet is a state of art too. Did you know that the most vulnerable part of an agent is the neck, Mr. Lockwood? This rim removes the danger. Don't you wish you had one? Lockwood shrugged. It's certainly unique. Wrong again. It's sophisticated, unusual, but not unique. Fairfax Iron isn't the only company to be working on remarkable innovations. These goggles now, he collected himself. But perhaps we're getting off the point. Fairfax sat back in his chair and regarded Lockwood for a few moments without speaking. He seemed to be weighing his words. Down in the cellar, he began slowly. I overheard you discussing a certain locket and a certain proof attached to it. In a spirit of casual interest, I'd be keen to know what you mean by proof, if indeed you mean anything. And after that, he smiled thinly. Perhaps you can tell me where the locket is and how exactly it may be found. We're hardly likely to help you there, George said. You'll only chuck us down the well. His pale and bloodied face was set in an expression of fierce defiance. Mine, I guessed, was similar, though also laced with deep repulsion. I could hardly bring myself to look at Fairfax at all. But Lockwood might have been chatting with a neighbor about the weather. It's all right, George, he said. I can give the man his proof. It's important we show him just how hopeless his position is. He crossed his legs and sat back, with every appearance of contentment. Well, Fairfax, as you guessed, we found the locket on Annabel Ward's body. We immediately knew that it had been given to her by her killer. Fairfax held up a hand. Wait, you knew this? How? Thanks to a psychic insight by Lucy here, Lockwood said. In touching it, she detected strong emotional traces that linked Annie Ward's unknown admirer with the moment of her death. The great head turned. The black eyes considered me for some seconds. Ah, yes, the sensitive Miss Carlyle. Something in the way he said it made my skin recoil. But legally speaking, Fairfax said, that's hogwash. There's no proof in it at all. Quite so, Lockwood said, which is why I wanted to understand the inscription we found on the locket. On the outside, this was Tormentum meum latitia me, my torment, my bliss, or similar gibberish. That told us a little, other than the guy who'd had the necklace made was a pretentious, self-regarding sort of fellow. But then, so many murderers aren't they, Fairfax? We needed something more. Silence in the library. The old man sat motionless, gnarled hands resting on the stubbed arms of his leather chair. His head jutted forward in a little attitude of strict attention. Next, Lockwood said, we came to what we found inside. This, if I recall correctly, was AWH 22115. 3 letters, A, W, and H, plus the mysterious set of numerals to begin with. The letters foxed us. In fact, they led us into a serious error. Our instant assumption was that AW stood for Annabel Ward, and that the H might therefore stand for her admirer's name. The newspapers of that time had highlighted her relationship with Hugo Blake, so this seemed a strong possibility. He'd been the last to see her alive, and he had been the only original suspect in the case. The police today also remembered Blake and soon arrested him. In fact, Lockwood continued, Blake was a complete red herring, which I might have realized after a careful study of the inscription. Wasn't it a bit odd that Annie Ward's initials were spelled out in full while her admirers were confined to a single letter? And what about the numbers? Numeral 2, number 2115. Was it some kind of code? A date? I'm sorry to say that I was stumped. He glanced at his watch a moment, then grinned across at me. Lucy made all the difference, Fairfax. She found a photo showing you in the same group as Annie Ward. At once, I knew you'd lied about your purpose in bringing us here. On the train down, I read about your early years in the theater and remembered that Annie Ward had acted too. I guess that might have been your connection. I also noted that you acted under your middle name, Will Fairfax. At once, that gave me a new solution to A.W., not Annie Ward, but Annie and Will. Still, the old man hadn't moved, or perhaps his head had dropped a little. His eyes were in deep shadow now and could not be seen. I didn't figure it out, the meaning of that final bit, until this evening, Lockwood said. We were on the screaming staircase at the time, and we've been a little busy ever since, so I hadn't had the chance to check yet. But I think we'll find that H22115 is a reference to one of the plays you acted in with Annie Ward. I bet it's some soppy quote that somehow binds the two of you together and which, if we investigated, would prove you knew each other very well indeed. He glanced up at the painting on the wall. If I had a guess, I'd say Hamlet, since that seems to be your personal favorite. But who can say, except you? He smiled and folded his hands across his knee. So, Mr. Fairfax, how about it? Perhaps now's the moment to fill us in. Fairfax didn't stir. Had he actually fallen asleep? It was almost possible, given how long Lockwood had been talking. Up by the bookcase, the man with the gun shifted. Clearly, he at least had grown impatient. "Almost 4:30, sir," he said. A cracked voice from the chair, from the shaded face. Yes. Just one question, Mr. Lockwood. You had the inscription. Why didn't you instantly show it to the police?" For a few seconds, Lockwood didn't answer. Pride, I suppose. I wanted to decode it myself. I wanted Lockwood and Company to have the glory. It was a mistake. I understand. Lockwood lifted his head, and if he had looked old before, now he looked positively deathlike, his eyes bright and ghastly, his gray skin clinging to the bones. Pride does terrible things to a man. In your case, it will be the death of you and your colleagues. In my case, it's led me to a lifetime of regret. He sighed. Well, your proof is good, and your intuition better. That last reference is indeed to Hamlet, in which Annie and I acted long ago. It's how we met. I was Prince Hamlet, and she played Ophelia, his betrothed. The locket refers specifically to Act 2, Scene 2, lines 115 to 118, which run, Doubt thou the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love. The old man paused. He stared into the dark. That's Hamlet to Ophelia, he said at last. He's saying that his love for her is utterly certain, more certain than anything else in the universe. Of course, in the play she drowns herself and he's poisoned, but the principle holds true. It's all about the passion between them, and passion is what Annie and I shared. Didn't stop you from killing her, I said. It was the first time that I'd spoken. Fairfax glanced towards me, black eyes dull like stones. You're a child, Miss Carlyle. You know nothing of such things. Wrong. I let my full scorn show. I know exactly what Annie Ward experienced. When I touched that locket, I felt it all. How nice for you, Fairfax said. You know, I've always thought that your kind of talent must be far more trouble than it's worth. Feeling another person's death pain, I can't say that's ever appealed to me. It's not just her death that I understand, I said quietly. I felt all the emotions that she experienced while she wore that necklace. I know everything she went through with you. And the memories had hardly faded either. I could still taste the girl's hysteria, her wild jealousness, her jealousies, her grief, her and anger, and finally, right at the end, "What a ridiculous skill you have," Fairfax said. "How terribly pointless and distracting. Still, you'll know when you'll know that then what a dark, difficult person Annie Ward was. She had a volatile personality and a poisonous temper, but she was beautiful all the same. We both acted in a number of immature productions, and this gave us the excuse to be together, for our relationship had to remain secret. Annie was not of the correct social standing, you see. Her father was a tailor or something of that kind, and my parents would have cut off my inheritance if they knew about her. Well, finally Annie demanded we go public. I refused, of course. The idea was impossible. So she left me." His lips drew back, teeth glinted. "For a time she went around with Hugo Blake, a fop, a worthless dandy. He was no good, and she knew it. Before long she was back with me." He shook his head. His voice grew louder. "I'm sorry to say that Annie was wayward. She socialized with people of whom I did not approve, including Blake. Though I had forbidden her to see him, we often argued. Our arguments grew worse. One night, I came to her house in secret and let myself in. She was out. I waited for her there. Imagine my rage when I saw her being dropped outside the door by none other than the vile Hugo Blake himself. As soon as she entered, I confronted her. We had a fearsome row, at the end of which I lost control. I struck her. She fell lifeless to the floor. I had broken her neck in a single blow." I shuddered. Right at the end, the final pain and terror. Yes, I'd felt that too. "Put yourself in my shoes, Mr. Lockwood," Fairfax went on. "Here was I, the heir to one of the largest industrial fortunes in England, kneeling by the body of the girl he'd killed. What could I do? If I called the police, I faced ruin, imprisonment, certainly, and perhaps the rope. 2 lives would have been destroyed because of a moment's madness. If, on the other hand, I left her lying there was still no guarantee I would escape. Perhaps someone had seen me enter the house? I couldn't be sure. So, I resolved upon a third solution. I would hide the body and conceal the crime. It took me almost 24 hours, Mr. Lockwood, to create my dear Annie's impromptu tomb. 24 hours that have stayed with me for 50 years. I had to locate a hiding place, knock through the wall, bring materials into the house to conceal that hole, and do all this unseen. Every moment I feared discovery. Every moment I had to labor with the body there beside me. The old man closed his eyes. He looked a ragged breath. Well, I got it done, and I have lived with the memory ever since. But in all my efforts, and this is the bitter irony, I forgot the locket. I didn't think of it. It slipped my mind. It was only weeks later that I recalled its existence and realized it might one day prove troublesome. And so it has. As soon as I read your newspaper article, I guessed you'd found it and were working on a solution. Subtle inquiries revealed the police knew Nothing. That gave me hope. I turned my attention to you. First, I tried to steal it. When Greb failed, I was forced to use more radical measures to ensure your silence. He sighed. Air whistled between the silver teeth. Now, the ghosts of Combe Carey have let me down too, and I'm going to have to finish the job myself. However, before I do, one simple question remains. What have you done with my locket? No one spoke. When I listened, with my inner ears, the house was empty. The visitors had gone. We were left with only mortal enemies, a killer, his henchmen, and a gun. I'm waiting, Fairfax said. He was completely calm. The prospect of murdering us didn't appear to distress him in the slightest. Lockwood, however, seemed just as relaxed, if not more so. Thanks for the story, he said. It was most enlightening and very useful, as it's helped us waste a bit more time. You see, I forgot to mention earlier that we're not going to be alone for long. Shortly before we arrived, I sent word via our driver to Inspector Barnes of Deeprack. I gave him enough information about you to incite his interest, and I asked him to meet us here by dawn. George and I stared at him. I remembered the package, the taxi driver, the money exchanging hands. He should arrive quite soon, Lockwood went on blithely. He leaned back in the chair and stretched his arms behind his head. In other words, it's all over for you, Fairfax, so we might as well relax. Why not get Greb to make us all a cup of tea? The old man's face was ghastly to observe. Hatred, fear, and disbelief washed over it in waves, and for a moment he was struck dumb. Then the expression cleared. You're bluffing, he said. And even if you're not, who cares? By the time anyone arrives, you'll have sadly met your end while fighting visitors by the haunted well. One after the other, you all fell in. I'll be terribly distraught. Barnes will be able to prove nothing. So, one final time of asking, where is the locket? No one said anything. Piercy, Fairfax said, shoot the girl. Wait! Lockwood and George leaped from their chairs. Okay, I cried. Okay, don't do it, I'll tell you. All eyes turned as I stood up. Fairfax leaned forward. Excellent. I thought you'd be the one to crack. So, where did you hide it, girl? Which room? Lucy, Lockwood began. Oh, it's not at Portland Row at all, I said. I've got it here. I was watching the old man's face as I spoke. I saw how his eyes drew tight in pleasure, how his mouth curled sensuously into a secretive half-smile. And something about the expression, fleeting as it was, opened a cracked and dirty window for me into his truest, deepest nature. It was something he genuinely kept hidden beneath the bluff, bombastic veneer of the caption of industry. It even underlay the dry regret of his long confession. I'd seen a lot that night at Combe Carey Hall, but that little gleeful smile on those old wide lips? Yeah, it was the self-love of the murderer, and easily the most repulsive thing of all. I wondered how many others had fallen foul of him over the years and how he had disposed of them. Show me then, he said. Sure. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Lockwood staring at me, trying desperately to catch my attention. I didn't meet his gaze. There was no point. I'd made my choice. I knew what I was going to do. I reached around the back of my neck and removed the loop of cord. As I pulled the case out, I thought I saw a flash of pale fire from beneath the glass. but the electric lights were bright in the library, and I might have been mistaken. I held the case in one hand and shot aside the little bolt. "Hey, that's silver glass," Grub said suddenly. "What's the locket doing in there?" I swung the lid open and tipped the necklace out into my palm. As I did so, I heard a little gasp from George. Fairfax spoke too, but I didn't heed him. I was listening to another sound far off, but swiftly drawing nearer. The locket was blisteringly cold, so cold it burned my skin. "Here you are," I said, "all yours." With that, I held my arm outstretched and turned my head aside. Up on the wall, the photo of young Fairfax, legs violently akimbo, considered thoughtfully the moldering skull. Here in the library, the old, decrepit Fairfax stared in sudden consternation at the necklace in my hand. Air struck the side of my face. My hair stretched out behind me. Chair legs scraped on the carpets. Tables shifted. I heard a great collective thump as all the books in the room slammed against the back of the wall of the shelves. Piercy Greb, who had been doing something with his gun, was blown back off his feet. He hit a bookshelf hard and collapsed onto the floor. Lockwood's chair spun into George's. Both were pressed back in their seats by the wave of force erupting from my hand. All the light bulbs in the library blew. It wasn't dark. To me, the room grew brighter, because the girl was there. She wore her pretty summer dress with orange flowers. She stood between me and Fairfax. And now the other light radiated from her like water. It poured into torrents, gushing over chairs and rugs and spilling around the reading desks in a bright and freezing tide. "I'm cold," a voice said. "So very cold." Into my head came the little hollow knocking sound I'd heard at Sheen Road the night it all began, like a fingernail on a plaster or a nail being hammered into the wood. It was rhythmic now, like the beating of a heart. Otherwise, it was all dead quiet. For instance, the ghost girl's eyes met mine, then she turned to face the old man in the chair. Fairfax sensed, but could not see her clearly. He was looking wildly around. Suddenly, his fingers scrabbled at the table. He found the goggles, pressed them into his eyes. He looked, he frowned. At once his face went slack, his body very still. The ghost girl drifted toward him, light streaming from her hair. The goggles drooped in Fairfax's hands. Hung at an acute diagonal across his nose, they fell away. His eyes were wrapped with wonder and in an awful fear. As a gentleman does when a lady enters the room, he got slowly, shakingly to his feet. He stood there, waiting. The girl opened her arms out wide. Perhaps Fairfax tried to move. Perhaps he tried to defend himself. But Ghostlock had him in its grip. His sword arm twitched slightly. His hand hung, helpless, above his belt. Off to the side, Lockwood fought free of the baleful influence. He tugged at George's arm, pulled him back behind the chairs and safely out of range. Coils of other light, like giant fingers, crossed in on Fairfax from all sides, and now the girl had reached him. Plasm touched the iron armor. It hissed and bubbled. The girl's forearm wavered, but held firm. She looked into the old man's eyes. He opened his mouth. He seemed about to speak. She clasped him to her, drew him downward in a cold embrace. Fairfax gave a single hollow cry, and the other light went out. The room was dark. I tilted my hand. The locket fell and broke into pieces on the floor. "Quickly! George! Get Grib!" That was Lockwood shouting. The chauffeur's form could just be seen, blundering away across the room, knocking around against furniture, making for the lobby. Lockwood grabbed a poker from the fireplace and followed. George leaped into pursuit, too, skimming a cushion past Grubb's head. Grubb ducked. His silhouette was outlined hazily against the lobby arch. He turned. A flash, a crack, a bullet whipped between us into the dark. Lockwood and George reached the arch, paused a moment, and passed through. Then, at once, there came a shouting and a crashing, and the sounds of voices raised, and despite the pain in my injured hand, I too was stumbling to the lobby, where, to my astonishment, I found the chauffeur sprawling on the ground with Lockwood's poker at his throat, the main entrance doors wide open, and Inspector Barnes and a crowd of grim-faced agents clustering into the hall. End of chapter 24.